Hello and welcome to my studio. I'll be demonstrating how to paint a favorite Christmas ornament. Let's get started. I'm going to be painting a Christmas card design of a snowman, and it's an ornament that I've had for several years, and I've kind of grown fond of him, and I would like to paint him for my Christmas card this year. So let's get to the preparation phase. The first thing I did was photographed the snowman with the Christmas lights on, so it was nice and glittery, and he's got some shine on him. I'm going to be painting him at 6 by 8 inches, or the perimeter of the painting is going to be 6 by 8. And I'm going to be using Arch is 140-pound paper. It's cold pressed and watercolor paper, of course. And I'll cut my paper about 1 inch bigger all the way around so that the paper is going to be in its final stage 8 by 10. Now I need to tape the paper down to my masonite board. And I'll be using artist tape. It's called Pro Artist Tape, and I'll put the link below. And I've taped the perimeter all the way around onto the masonite that I'm using. And I've also taken the artist tape and made a border all the way around my snowman design, and that brings it to 6 by 8. This creates like a self mat, which is really neat, and it'll be a nice clean edge when I'm finished. I drew my snowman with HB pencil. I did some tracing to make my drawing faster, and I'll discuss this practice in a future video. Next, I used a lint roller to roll off any excess graphite. And this is just a typical lint pickup roller that's sticky, and you roll it back and forth and it picks up any excess graphite or junk that's on your drawing surface. So you can see from another drawing I did how much this actually does pick up. I also used Winsor & Newton masking fluid, and I put it just on the areas that I wanted extra bright white, and there's another video attached to this that shows you how to use the masking fluid. All right, so I'm going to get started on the painting phase of this painting. And I've got the drawing ready and everything's ship shape and ready to go, and my masking fluid is nice and dry. And I'll be using Robert Simmons brushes. These are sapphire brushes. And I also have a flat that is a Robert Simmons, I can't remember the name of it. It's a 1-inch brush flat. But at any rate, I'm going to start with the snowman itself. I'm going to just look at it, and I also have a photograph that I'm looking at as reference. Sometimes your printouts are not as good as what you see on your monitor, so you may decide to use your tablet if that's a better source for you for images. I'm going to start with a bit of a smaller brush today, and I'm analyzing the colors in the snowman, and he's very warm, like a warm white, creamy white, and I want to get that color through the painting. So what would make up that creamy white? Well, I would kind of think that like a pale yellow would work, and the yellow that I've chosen for this will be a lemon yellow. I leave my colors on my palette, and then I go back to it. If I need, I don't throw my paints away, is what I'm saying. All right, so I've got my lemon yellow to start, and I'm going to use that color to tint the snowman. where I see that color, I'm going to just drop it in. And really, this serves as to wet the snowman as well as to add color. And I'll just work on his head right now. I'm also seeing a little bit of warm in there, like a pink. I'm going to use quinacridone rose, or permanent rose would work fine. I'm going to mix a little bit of the rose into the yellow and work it in the wet areas. And you've probably heard the term wet into wet. Well, this is a wet into wet technique. And I'm using a light touch. Because watercolor dries lighter, I'm going to put a little bit more yellow. Because watercolor dries lighter, you have to compensate for the lack of color on your dried product. So I'm taking a little bit of extra pigment or paint and highlighting a little bit more. And so he's got a lot more color in him. So in our brains we say white snowman, but this is not white. So get away from preconceptions of what we know in our heads, and what we actually see is more important. Then on one side I see a shadow. What makes up that shadow? It almost looks violet to me. So I'm going to take Winsor Violet, and to cool off my Winsor Violet, I'm going to take a bit of cobalt blue and cool it off. You notice that I'm talking about temperatures. I'll be doing a video on seeing paints in temperatures, but that's how I see things. And you see it's a cool but has a warm edge to it. And I see a shadow on that side of his face. When I wet my brush, I dab it off on my paper towel so I don't have a ton of water running away. Find color in shadows. That's really important. And I think that works pretty well. I'm going to use a little bit more of the pink. Take some of that rose and feather upward and blend the shadow on one side of his head. And blend a little bit here. And a little bit more color or rose at the bottom of his neck. And I'm done with the color on his head. Okay, now I'm going to start on the rest of the body. And it's the same method. I'm going to start with the lemon yellow and use that as my basic color. I'm using a number 8 brush. So it's clear water and just adding the lemon yellow as my base. If your brush feels a little bit dry, just pick up a little water and paint. Be aware of where your shadow is. And the warm and the cools that are reflected from the lights around it. I'm also removing paint as I have a dry brush. I could pick up the paint with my brush like that. So it gives it a sense of contour. And this is looking very nice. Now I'm going to add a little bit of the pink to it, which again, going back to the same formula, the permanent rose or quinacridone rose works really well. If you have alizarin crimson, that could work too, but I think that the rose is a little less reddish and makes for a better combination. So see, I've added the pink around it and left the yellow to do its thing at the bottom. And that's looking good. Under the buttons is a little of that pink. Since the water is taking the paint, it's working wet into wet. The snowman will be worked wet into wet, the main part of his body. So I've added yellow along the edge, and I'm blending the pink down with a little yellow in it. And there appears to be a little bit more yellow out here on his neck by his scarf. So you can see the variations in the whites. White is not white white. And there's always colors that are bouncing around and reflecting on snow or whatever it might be. In this case, a glass ornament. Now, I'm going to add the shadows in. But if I do this, it's going to bleed out too much because it's pretty wet. So I'm going to wait a few minutes on that. And since the head is pretty dry, I'm going to see if there's anything I need to do there to make any changes. And I think I would like to gray up the shadow here. I've added a tiny bit of Payne's Gray. I use Winsor & Newton Payne's Gray. I really like that color. No other manufacturer makes one that really works quite that well for me, but it's such an individual choice. So I'm adding that dark Payne's Gray mixed into my gray and blend it a little bit. And dampen my brush and blend the edge. And I think that's about finished. And then now I'm going to check this, and it looks like it's ready to put in my shadow. So I'm going back to the pot of shadow color. I've picked up a little bit more rose. And some of the cool. And I think that does the job. If I needed to dull it, I could put a drop of Payne's Gray into it, and that works nicely. It just takes it away from being a violet. And I think that looks good. I'm going to take my brush, clean it off, and soften up this edge. And a little bit more dark around the perimeter. And there's a shadow under the scarf. In your brain, remember that this is a three-dimensional ornament, and that's the effect I want. So it's a sculptural form. And I need that edge a tiny bit darker. So again, the same formula of Payne's Gray. And let's darken that up a little. Again, remembering that it is going to dry a lot lighter than you really want it. Okay, I'm back to draw. I've got the white of the snowman completely finished. I think he's just about where I want him. And I've developed a darker shadow along the bottom. Now I'm going to put a little bit more glaze of gray over where the scarf is. And that'll give it a 3D feel. I'm getting an edge. You can see that. And sometimes that happens from moving your paint along the side of a passage. So sometimes you could pick it up with a paper towel or the edge of your brush. I'm going to take part of my paper towel and blot it so I have an area of light. And under his arm, I think I need a tiny bit more violet. The paint underneath is dry, which is good. So I could build on top of that without it washing away. All right, now I'm going to work on the detail. I'm going to dry everything with a dryer and then start with the scarf. All right, I'm looking at the snowman ornament, and it's a three-dimensional form, and that's something to keep remembering. And it builds outward. So you want to try to achieve that within your painting. And it's not a design, it's not a cartoon, it doesn't look flat. So I'm going to go back to my photograph. And try to get that feeling. I'm taking a dark green, and the green I'm using is phthalo green shade, and I'm mixing that with a bit of Payne's gray. So phthalo green mixed with Payne's gray, and that should give you a beautiful, beautiful green. The brush I'm using gives me a decent point. It's a nice point. And I'm drawing with my brush. The drawing is underneath it, and I try to follow my drawing to some degree, but then sometimes you sort of lose your drawing too. So now I have to come back and redraw, and that's why I like to have a pointed brush. All right, the green gets darker on one side and lighter on the other, so I'm going to take that same color and do the same thing, but this time make it more intense. Darker on one side, and it's a shadow side that's on the same shadow side as the shadow of the body. There's a logic of light that you need to achieve. So you can see the darkness on this side, the light over here, and it's starting to develop a three-dimensional feel. There's also some dark stripes on the side of his scarf. And if there's any white, this brush is nice because I could avoid those areas. Okay, I think I'm done with the green for now. Maybe a little bit more. It's starting to dry too light. Good. All right, let's put that away. Next, the orange of his nose, the carrot. I put a little bit of masking fluid on the tip of the nose. I'm going to try to clean out an area on my palette so it's nice and pure. And you don't want any fallout from other colors in your paints, especially in an area like this. And I'm using cadmium orange. I'm going to start with my cadmium. It's a Winsor & Newton color. And even that it's orange, there's a dark side and a light side. And the dark side of that orange, I'm going to use a little bit of Winsor violet. For the shadow. And the orange, again, the cad orange is nice and bright. And I'm going to put that right here along the edge. I'm going to add a tiny bit of rose, more than I wanted, along this edge. And there's a lot of blending involved here. And that's it. I'm going to leave it alone now. But I said I was, but now I'm going to add a little bit more purple. There, that's good. All right, I think that part of it's done. Now I'm going to dry it. So I've got shadow on one side of his nose, the carrot, and light on the opposite side. and clean off my brush. There's also some bright red orange out here on the handle of the pot. And the color is cadmium orange with permanent rose. And as it goes down and darkens, I'm going to pick up some Winsor violet. And I think that's looking really good. And now the pot on top of his head is gray. In our minds, we say that the color is gray, but it really isn't. It really has different colors within it. And I'm looking at violet, yellow, and gray. So the violet would be my Winsor violet, which I use all the time. And to counter the color of the violet, I use the complement of the color, which is yellow ochre, and that'll complement it and dull it down a little bit. I'm adding a bit of cobalt blue. I overshot this, so I'm going to fix it. There, that's good. And that gray, I'm going to add a tiny bit of Payne's gray into it. And more Payne's gray. I'm now using Payne's Gray and a bit of Van Dyke Brown to change the quality of the handle from the pot itself, so it makes it look like a steel handle. And that's finished. I'm going to make the pot, the handle brighter. It dried too light. And get my cadmium orange and quinacridone rose and make a nice orange. And glaze over this. I'm putting some shadows in the scarf. Going right over the green lightly. You want to leave ridges. And some shadows around the buttons. And I'll dry it really well and remove the masking fluid. I want to darken the shadow on the pot handle one more time before I go on. And darken the side of the hat since I have the color already blended. The hat being the pot. And now I'm going to take a rubber cement pickup eraser and pull off my masking fluid. Now I'm doing the little brown bird, since I'm done with the rest of the snowman. And I'm using my fine point brush. The color I'm using is burnt sienna. And these are all Winsor & Newton colors that I'm using for today's painting. I'm going to put in my dark with a little bit of the gray that I made with Winsor Violet and some Payne's Gray. And that'll give it the shadow under the belly of the bird. And I'd like it a little bit brighter. So there's another Winsor & Newton color that I really like. And that's called Brown Matter. And I'm going to put brown matter on the top of the bird. And it's more of a mahogany color that's very, very useful. I'm going to mix a little dark. And then dry it with the dryer. Then I have my little fine brush. I'm going to put in the eyeball for the bird. And increase the shadow. Under the beak. Blend it a little bit. And my snowman is painted. I like what I've got going, and what I would do with the rest of it is I'll just talk about this by wetting the background and put some color in the background. If I found any lights, I could come in with some Winsor & Newton masking fluid just to pop a few lights in it. And you'll see that in the fast forward. All right, thanks a lot.